The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as familiar to these parts as the drone of a two-cylinder John Deere in a heavy pull. It was the spring of '71, and another farm was dying. Old man Abernathy's place. His heart had given out a month prior, right in the middle of his morning chores. Now, his life's work was being scattered to the four winds, sold piece by piece to the highest bidder. I stood near the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jacket. My name is Silas Miller. I wasn't there for the land. I had my 240 acres, the same ground my father and his father had worked, and it was all I could handle and all I wanted. I was just there to watch, to pay my respects in a way, and maybe pick up a few odds and ends if they went cheap. A good set of wrenches, a spare hydraulic cylinder, the kind of things that keep an old farm running. The air smelled of damp earth, diesel exhaust, and the cheap cigars some of the older fellas were smoking. Men in seed corn hats and muddy work boots stood in tight knots, their voices a low murmur beneath the auctioneer's chant. They were vultures of a sort, but not malicious ones. It was just the way of things. One man falls, another picks up the pieces and carries on. My gaze drifted from the auctioneer's stand to my truck, a '65 Chevy C10, parked at the edge of the lane. Its faded blue paint was worn through to the primer on the hood, but the 283 under it purred like a contented cat. Beside it sat my real pride and joy, the machine that was the heart of my operation, my 1967 Farmall 806. I'd hauled it over on the gooseneck just in case a heavy implement went for a song. The big diesel tractor was caked in the honest dirt of last fall's ploughing, its International Harvester red paint still deep and rich where the grease and sun hadn't faded it. It wasn't shiny, but it was sound. Every gasket, every hose, every drop of fluid in it was known to me. I'd bought it used 4 years ago, paying cash I'd saved up since I was a boy. It was mine. All mine. A stir went through the crowd as the auctioneer moved from the household goods to the machinery line. A few tired ploughs and a rusty disc went for scrap prices. Then, a newer sound cut through the air. It was the throaty rumble of a big V8, and it wasn't coming from the auction block. A brand new two-tone Ford F-250 Ranger, gleaming in green and white, pulled up and parked with an arrogant crunch of gravel. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped Frank Blevins. Frank was 10 years younger than me, full of spit and vinegar, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd inherited his father's prime bottomland a few years back, and had been expanding aggressively ever since. He wore a clean, new jacket, and his boots looked like they'd never seen the business end of a manure fork. He clapped a few guys on the back, his voice louder than anyone else's, making sure everyone saw him. He wasn't here for wrenches. He was here for the land. When the auctioneer finally announced the sale of the Abernathy 160, a hush fell. That was the prize. Good, flat, black dirt that could grow corn tall as a man on a horse. The bidding started fast. Frank jumped in early, his bids confident and round. He was bidding against the bank, against a couple of big operators from the next county over. I watched him, his jaw set, a glint of hunger in his eyes. He was leveraging himself to the hilt, and everyone knew it. The final price was staggering, nearly double what the land had been worth just 5 years earlier. The gavel fell. Sold to Mr. Frank Blevins. A wave of whispers went through the crowd. Some were impressed, others were uneasy. Taking on that kind of debt was a gamble that could make a man or break him completely. As the crowd started to thin, Frank swaggered over toward my truck. He stopped and looked at my 806, a smirk playing on his lips. He ran a hand over the fender, then wiped it on his jeans as if he'd touched something unclean. "Still running this old relic, Silas?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I pulled my hands from my pockets. She runs just fine, Frank. Fired right up this morning, cold as it was. Yeah, but for how long? He chuckled. I just put my order in. Brand new John Deere, 4630. Coming straight from Waterloo. Got the sound guard cab, air conditioning, radio, the works. 150 horses at the PTO. Thing's a beast. I'll be able to plow that new 160 in 2 days. What would take you a week with this thing? I just nodded slowly, looking at my tractor. The 806 wasn't small. Its D361 diesel engine put out a respectable 95 horsepower, more than enough for my 4-bottom plow. The torque amplifier let you shift down on the fly for tough spots. It was a solid, dependable machine, born of iron and sweat. That Deere sounds like a nice tractor, I said, my voice even. Comes with a nice payment book too, I imagine. Frank's smirk widened. You gotta spend money to make money, Silas. That's something your old man never understood, and it looks like you don't either. Farming's a business now, not a hobby. You gotta get big or get out. He gestured toward my 806. That thing, it's a museum piece. You're sitting out there in the dust and the heat, wrestling with that gear shift, while I'll be sitting in my air-conditioned cab listening to the radio. It's about efficiency, progress. I leaned against the warm tire of my Farmall. It felt solid, real. This museum piece is paid for, Frank. Every last bolt. When I turn the key, the only man I have to answer to is myself. I know how to fix every part on it, with the tools in my own shop. Can you say the same about that computer on wheels you're buying? When that fancy transmission of yours acts up, who are you going to call? The dealer, who's going to hand you a bill with 4 digits on it. I looked him square in the eye. My dad taught me something different. He said the bank can't repossess sweat equity, and they can't foreclose on a machine you own outright. This tractor doesn't just represent horsepower to me. It represents freedom. Frank just laughed, a short, sharp bark. Freedom to stay small, you mean? You enjoy your freedom, Silas. I'll be busy making money. He turned and walked back to his shiny new truck, leaving me standing in the long shadow of my old red tractor. The thing is, I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. His new Deere was a marvel of engineering. It was faster, stronger, and more comfortable. By every modern measure, it was better. My way was harder. It was slower. It meant greasy hands and long nights in the shop. It meant swallowing my pride when my neighbors finished their planting a week before I did. But it also meant I slept soundly at night, knowing that whatever happened with the weather or the price of corn, the ground under my feet and the iron in my shed were mine. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever been in a spot like that? Staring at the choice between the old, reliable machine you owned free and clear, and the shiny new one that came with a heavy payment book. Let me know in the comments below what you did, and if you look back on it now, would you do it the same way today? I'm curious to know what you think. A week later, a flatbed truck from the John Deere dealership rumbled through town. On its back was Frank Blevins's 46 SR30. It was a giant. The rear tires were taller than I was, and the cab sat up high like a glass-walled command center. It didn't just look new, it looked like it was from the future. Frank had them unload it right at the edge of his new property, the old Abernathy place, which bordered a section of my own land. For the next few days, the sound of that big 6-cylinder Deere turbo was a constant presence. It was a deep, powerful roar that carried for miles, a sound completely different from the sharp bark of my naturally aspirated International engine. I'd be out on my 806, pulling my old 5-shank chisel plough, eating dust and feeling the vibration of the engine through the steel seat, and I could see him across the fence row. Frank was sitting up in that clean, quiet cab, a silhouette behind the tinted glass. He'd plough around in what felt like half the time it took me. He didn't have to stop to wipe the grit from his eyes. He didn't have to bundle up against the raw April wind. He was in his own little world, cool and comfortable, turning black earth with an enormous 7-bottom plough like it was nothing. The talk at the co-op was all about Frank. Did you see the size of that thing? Ploughed 80 acres before lunch, they say. That Blevins boy, he's going to own this whole county one day. When I walked in for a bag of seed corn, the conversations would quiet down for a second. I'd get a few sympathetic nods, the kind you give a man you think is falling behind. They saw my old Farmall as a symbol of my failure to keep up. They saw Frank's green monster as the pinnacle of success. I tried to ignore it. I had work to do. But one afternoon, the struggle became more than just a matter of pride. I was making my last pass on a tough piece of clay ground when I felt a lurch. The tractor's forward momentum softened, even though the engine was still pulling hard. I knew the feeling instantly. The torque amplifier was slipping. The TA was a brilliant piece of IH engineering, a 2-speed planetary gear set that let you drop your speed and increase your torque without touching the clutch, perfect for hitting a tough spot in the field. But they were also the 806's known weak point. I limped the tractor back to the shop, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Planting season was breathing down my neck. A week of downtime now could cost me thousands in yield come harvest time. That night, the shop was my sanctuary and my prison. The single bare bulb hanging from the rafters cast long, distorted shadows. The air was thick with the smell of old grease, cold steel, and penetrating oil. I had the service manual, a thick, Bible-like book with oil-smudged pages, spread open on the workbench. Step 1 was splitting the tractor. It was a job I'd read about but never done. It meant separating the massive engine and front end from the transmission and rear housing. I started by draining the 20-some gallons of high-tran fluid, the lifeblood of the transmission and hydraulics. The stream of reddish oil gurgling into the drain pan seemed to echo the sinking feeling in my gut. I blocked up the front half, then carefully built a cribbing of heavy oak blocks under the transmission housing. Using 2 heavy-duty floor jacks, I supported the 2 halves. Then came the tedious part, disconnecting everything that crossed the divide. Fuel lines, hydraulic hoses, wiring harnesses, the steering column. Each bolt was a battle. Some were rusted solid and had to be heated with the acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red before they'd break free with a painful shriek of metal. My knuckles were skinned, my back ached, and my face was smeared with a mixture of grease and sweat. Finally, after hours of work, it was time. I took a deep breath and began to carefully roll the front half of the tractor away from the rear. It moved an inch, then 2, separating with a groan. The clutch assembly was exposed, and beyond it, the input shaft to the transmission where the TA unit was housed. There it was, my enemy. The next 2 days were a blur of meticulous work. I had to special order the TA clutch pack and seals from the dealer in the city, and the parts kid on the phone didn't even know what an 806 was at first. While I waited, I cleaned every gear, every bearing, every surface, until it was spotless. I worked by the dim light of the shop bulb late into the night, and was back at it before the sun came up. During a parts run into town, I saw Frank at the diner. He was holding court in a corner booth, laughing with a couple of other farmers. He saw me at the counter, my hands stained with grease that no amount of soap could remove. "Heard you were having some trouble, Silas," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That old girl finally give up on you? If you get in a real bind, I could come over and plant your corn for you. For a small fee, of course. Can't let that ground go to waste." The other men chuckled. I just looked at him, my face grim. "I'll manage, Frank," I said, then paid for my coffee and left. The laughter followed me out the door. The scorn was worse than the broken tractor. They saw me as a stubborn fool, a relic just like my machine. They didn't see the quiet pride in knowing how to fix what was yours, in breathing life back into a piece of iron with your own 2 hands. They only saw that I was losing time, and in their world, time was money Frank was making, and I was losing. Finally, the parts arrived. I reassembled the torque amplifier with the care of a watchmaker, each seal seated perfectly, each clutch plate soaked in fresh high-tran. The hardest part was rejoining the 2 halves of the tractor, inching them together with the floor jacks, trying to align the splines of the input shaft. It took hours of tiny adjustments, of cursing and sweating, before they finally slid together with a satisfying thud. By Saturday evening, it was done. I reconnected the last fuel line, topped off the fluids, and climbed into the seat. My whole body ached. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the big diesel over. It caught, sputtered, and then roared to life, filling the shop with a cloud of blue smoke and a beautiful, powerful noise. The engine settled into a steady, healthy idle. I pushed the clutch, shifted the TA lever, and felt it engage with a solid, firm click. It was fixed. I had done it. I was 3 days behind schedule. The weather forecast was calling for rain by the middle of the week. I had to get the planter in the field, and I had to do it now. As I worked that Sunday, planting corn under a nervous sky, I could see across the fence that Frank's fields were already planted, the neat rows of turned earth waiting for the sun. He had won this round, no question. My small victory in the shop felt hollow under the vast, unforgiving sky. My yields that fall were average, nothing more. Frank, on the other hand, had a bin-buster of a crop. He'd made a fortune. The next few years seemed to prove Frank right and me wrong. The early 1970s were a golden age for American agriculture. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly arranged to buy nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. wheat crop. It became known as the Great Grain Robbery, and it sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans followed. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a living, it was a gold rush. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was cheering it on. The message from Washington was clear. Get bigger. Plant fence row to fence row. Take out loans. Buy more land. Buy bigger equipment. The world is hungry, and you, the American farmer, are going to feed it, and get rich doing it. Frank Blevins became the local poster boy for this new philosophy. The massive profits from his bumper crop in 71, followed by the price explosion in 72 and 73, gave him an incredible war chest. But he didn't bank it. He leveraged it. With his land value soaring, the bank was happy to lend him anything he wanted. He bought another 320 acres from a family that was looking to retire. He traded in the 2-year-old 4630 for a brand-new John Deere 4840, an articulated 4-wheel drive monster that made his last tractor look like a garden toy. He bought a new Gleaner N6 combine with a corn head that could swallow 8 rows at a time. His farm became a showcase of the latest and greatest technology. He was the first in the county to practice no-till farming on a large scale. He put up massive grain bins with automated dryers. His wife drove a new Chrysler Town and Country station wagon, the one with the fake wood paneling on the sides. They added a big new wing to their house. At the diner, Frank wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a businessman, an agricultural tycoon in the making. He'd talk about amortization schedules and depreciation, about hedging his crops on the futures market. The other farmers listened with a mixture of awe and envy. He was living the dream. And me? I was still running the '67 Farmall 806. The good years were good to me too. I wasn't losing money. In fact, I was making more than I ever had. But I saw the boom for what it was. A bubble. My grandfather had told me stories about the 1920s, when land prices shot up after the Great War, and farmers borrowed heavily to expand, only to be wiped out when the bottom fell out. History, he used to say, doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Instead of buying more land, I improved the land I had. I used the extra money to hire a man with a tiling machine to lay drainage tile through a 40-acre patch of low ground that had always been too wet. It was a huge expense, but it was a one-time cost that would pay dividends in better yields for the rest of my life. Instead of buying a new tractor, I invested in my old one. I pulled the 806 into the shop one winter and gave it a complete in-frame overhaul. New sleeves, pistons, rings, bearings. I had the injector pump and nozzles rebuilt by a specialist in Des Moines. When I was done, that D361 engine ran smoother and stronger than the day it left the factory in Rock Island. I put a new set of Firestone 18-mile 38s on the rear. I even splurged on a new padded seat. To everyone else, it was just the same old tractor with a bit of a facelift. To me, it was practically a new machine, and it still didn't come with a payment book. My biggest move came in the fall of 1978. I walked into the Farmers Trust and Savings Bank and wrote the final check on the mortgage for my family's original 240 acres. The farm was officially mine, free and clear. Mr. Henderson, the bank president, who had been so eager to lend Frank Blevins hundreds of thousands of dollars, looked at my final payment check with a strange expression. It wasn't happiness for me. It was almost disappointment. "Well, Silas," he said, stamping my paperwork with a heavy finality. "Congratulations. You're one of the few left who can say that. You're a lucky man to be out of debt right now." There was an odd weight to his words. "Why's that?" I asked. He lowered his voice a little, leaning over the counter. "The Fed is getting nervous about inflation. Talk is they're going to start jacking up the prime interest rate to cool things down. It's at 8% now. I'm hearing whispers it could go to 10, maybe even 12% next year." My blood ran a little cold. A 12% interest rate was unthinkable. As I turned to leave, the bank door opened, and in walked Frank Blevins, laughing about something with a seed salesman. He slapped Mr. Henderson on the back and winked at me. "Silas, cashing in your piggy bank? I'm just heading in to talk to old Bill here about financing a new center pivot irrigation system for my west quarter. Got to keep up with the times." He disappeared into Henderson's office, the door closing behind him. I stood on the steps of the bank, the paid-in-full deed in my hand. It felt solid, but strangely small. Across the town square, the autumn wind rustled the dry leaves in the gutter, making a sound like whispering voices. A dark bank of clouds was building on the western horizon. A storm was coming, a different kind of storm. Frank was inside, signing papers for yet another loan, while the world outside was about to change forever. He couldn't see it. Nobody could. But standing there, with that piece of paper in my hand and the feel of the cold wind on my face, I felt a shiver of dread. The good times were over. They just didn't know it yet. The first tremor came in the winter of 799, but it wasn't in the ground. It was on the nightly news. President Carter was on the television, his face grim, announcing a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, and the spoon in my hand stopped halfway to my mouth. The Soviets had been buying our grain for years, propping up the prices that had made men like Frank Blevins rich. Just like that, the tap was turned off. The talk at the co-op turned sour overnight. The optimism that had fueled the 70s evaporated like a morning fog. Corn prices, which had been flirting with $3 a bushel, tumbled. Then they fell some more. At the same time, the cost of everything else went up. Diesel fuel, fertilizer, seed. The inflation that had been a gentle updraft for land prices was now a wildfire burning through our input costs. And then came the letters from the bank. The prime rate, the number that had been a sleepy little detail on our loan papers, was awake, and it was angry. 10%, 12, 15. I saw the change in Frank first. The swagger was gone, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. He spent more time in his pickup, driving the perimeter of his fields, not looking at the crops, but just staring, as if he was trying to hold the land together by sheer force of will. The new irrigation rig he'd bought sat half-assembled in the field, a skeleton of galvanized steel pointing at a sky that refused to rain. The summer of 1980 was a scorcher. The corn tasseled early, stunted by the heat. The leaves on the soybean plants curled up in the afternoons, a desperate, thirsty prayer. My tiled ground, the land I'd invested in instead of buying more, held on. The tiles helped it retain the moisture from the spring rains, and my corn stayed green a week longer than Frank's. But even I was hurting. My yields were down by a third. For Frank, with his massive acreage and even more massive debt, it was a catastrophe. He had borrowed money at 8% to plant a crop based on $3 corn. Now he was paying 17% interest on that loan and selling the drought-stunted crop for $2.20. The math was brutal. It was upside down. The real breaking point, though, came during the harvest. I was out on my old International 9x15 combine, a simple, rugged machine I'd bought for cash from a retiring neighbor. It was slow and it was dusty, but it ran. One afternoon, I saw Frank's giant Gleaner N6 sitting silent in the middle of a field, its huge 8-row corn head pointed at the sky. A dealer's service truck was parked beside it. It sat there for 2 days. I found out what happened from one of the mechanics at the co-op. A main hydraulic pump had failed. Not just any pump, but the one that ran the hydrostatic transmission, the very heart of the machine. It wasn't a part you could just unbolt and replace. It was buried deep in the guts of the combine, a complex piece of high-pressure engineering. The mechanic said the part alone was over $4,000, and the labor to install it was nearly as much. Frank had to wait 2 days for the part to be shipped from the factory. 2 beautiful, clear, perfect harvesting days, lost. With a big storm front moving in from the west, he finally got it running, just as the sky turned a bruised purple. He harvested with a frantic energy, running the big machine late into the night, its floodlights cutting a lonely swath through the darkness. But the storm came, a hard, driving rain that flattened what little crop was left in the fields and turned the ground to a thick, impassable gumbo. I finished my harvest the day before the rain, my smaller machine covering my smaller acres. I stored my grain in my old cribs, waiting, hoping for a price rally that I knew probably wasn't coming. Frank had to sell his wet corn straight out of the field, taking a massive penalty for high moisture content at the elevator. He had no choice. The bank was calling. That winter was the quietest I can ever remember. The usual optimism that came with planning for the next season was gone, replaced by a cold dread. The price of land, which had been Frank's golden ticket, started to fall. His net worth was evaporating on paper, even as the interest on his loans compounded daily in reality. He tried to sell off the 80 acres where the irrigation rig sat, but there were no buyers. Nobody had money. Nobody had credit. The very banks that had been begging farmers to borrow money a few years earlier were now padlocking their vaults. The final straw was his big four-wheel drive, the John Deere 4840. He was trying to do some fall tillage, trying to get a jump on the next year, trying to pretend things were still normal. I was out fixing a fence line when I heard it. Not a bang, but a series of loud metallic shrieks, followed by a sickening grinding noise that made the hair on my arm stand up. Then silence. He'd lost a planetary gear in one of the final drives. It was a known issue with those early models if you pushed them too hard. The repair was astronomical. It required special tools, a clean workshop, and a mechanic who knew what he was doing. The dealer quoted him a price that was more than I'd paid for my whole 806 tractor. Frank didn't have the money. He just left the big green tractor sitting where it died, a monument to a broken dream, its front wheel canted at an unnatural angle. For the rest of the winter, it sat there, collecting snow, a silent green tombstone in the middle of a dead cornfield. The cracks in Frank's empire were no longer cracks. They were gaping chasms, and he was falling. The wave of foreclosures started in the spring of '82. It wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. Green and white signs from the Farmers' Home Administration popped up along the county roads like bitter weeds. Farm auctions were no longer a neighborly affair, where one man's misfortune allowed another to carry on. They were grim, angry events. Farmers would show up and bid $1 on their neighbor's equipment, then give it back to him, a desperate act of communal defiance against the banks. But it never worked. The bank would just bid it up themselves and haul the equipment away. I saw good men whose families had farmed the same ground for 100 years, break down and weep openly as the auctioneer sold off their heritage. I saw wives with hard, stoic faces, trying to hold their families together as their homes and their futures were sold for pennies on the dollar. The optimism of the 70s had curdled into the despair of the 80s. The slogan, "Get big or get out," had reached its brutal conclusion. A lot of people were getting out. Frank Blevins held on longer than most. He sold his wife's station wagon. He sold his cattle. He tried to restructure his loans, spending his days in tense, hushed meetings at the bank instead of in his fields. But the numbers were impossible. The interest rates had peaked at over 20%. There was no crop on earth that could pay off a loan at 20% interest when commodity prices were in the tank. The notice for his auction appeared in the paper in the fall of 1983. It was a full-page ad. 720 acres, late model home, full line of John Deere and Gleaner machinery. It was the biggest farm auction the county had ever seen. It felt like the death of a king. I went. I didn't know why, exactly. It wasn't to gloat. The satisfaction I might have felt years ago had long since been replaced by a profound sadness for my entire community. I parked my old Chevy pickup down the road and walked up the long lane to his house, the same lane where he'd parked his shiny new Ford a dozen years earlier. The scene was a funereal version of the Abernathy auction. The crowd was bigger, but quieter. The faces were gaunt, worried. These weren't vultures picking over a carcass. They were fellow soldiers surveying a battlefield, wondering who would be next. The machinery was lined up, just as it had been at Abernathy's. But this wasn't tired old equipment. It was a fleet of modern marvels. The crippled 4840 had been hauled in and sat there, a wounded giant. The Gleaner N6 combine, barely 5 years old. A whole line of massive tillage equipment. It was millions of dollars of iron, bought on the promise of a boom that had gone bust. I saw Frank standing near the porch of his house, the one he'd built the big addition on. He looked 10 years older. His jacket was worn, his face was pale, and the fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He was a ghost at his own funeral. His wife was beside him, her arms crossed tightly, her face a mask of grief. I didn't try to talk to him. What was there to say? The auctioneer started, his voice lacking its usual energetic rhythm. It was somber, respectful. The machinery went for a fraction of what it was worth. Big operators from 2 states away, men who had somehow managed to stay solvent, were there to pick up the bargains. The land was sold last. It was broken up into parcels. The home place, the Abernathy 160, the bottom land his father had left him. All of it went under the gavel. The bank bought most of it back, as there were few other bidders with that kind of capital. Throughout it all, I stayed in the background. My own farm was safe. The paid-off deed was in a safe deposit box in town. My 806 was in the shed, its engine sound, its tires holding air. The low prices hurt me, but they couldn't break me. I had no debt, my cost of living was low. I sold a few hogs, a few bushels of corn for cash to get by. I fixed my own equipment, welded my own broken parts, made do with what I had. The very things Frank had mocked me for, my old tractor, my cautious nature, my refusal to take on debt, had become my armor. I had survived. But standing there, watching Frank Blevins lose everything, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a tragedy. The auction was over by late afternoon. The crowd dispersed, leaving the Blevins family alone in the middle of their empty farmstead. A few neighbors brought over covered dishes, the quiet, rural gesture of condolence. I walked back to my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. The setting sun cast long shadows across the empty fields, shadows that looked like grasping fingers. I drove home and pulled into my own lane. I stopped the truck and just sat there for a long time, looking at my modest house, my sturdy old barn, the shed where my Farmall was parked. It wasn't an empire, it wasn't a showcase, but it was mine. Every nail, every board, every bolt. In the silence of the cab, I finally understood what my father had meant. The bank can't repossess sweat equity. They couldn't take what was truly yours. A week later, I went to the bank. I sat down with Mr. Henderson, who looked as tired and worn as everyone else. The crisis had been hard on the banks, too. "I want to buy a piece of land," I told him. He looked at me, surprised. "Silas, now is not the time to be expanding." "I'm not expanding," I said. "The bank now owns the old Abernathy 160, correct? The piece that borders my east field." "That's right," he said cautiously. "I'll buy it from you," I said. "Cash." Henderson's jaw dropped. In 1983, nobody was paying cash for farmland. I had saved my money during the good years. I hadn't bought new trucks or added on to the house. I had put it in savings bonds and certificates of deposit. It wasn't a fortune, but with land prices at rock bottom, it was enough. We haggled for a bit, but he knew I was the only real buyer he was likely to find. We settled on a price that was less than a third of what Frank had paid for it 12 years earlier. The next day, I drove over to the small house in town where the Blevins family was now living. Frank came to the door. He looked lost. "Frank," I said, getting straight to the point, "I bought the old Abernathy place." A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he just nodded. Good for you, Silas. You earned it. You were right all along. That's not why I'm here, I said. I'm not going to farm it. Not this year, anyway. I need someone to look after it for me. Someone who knows that ground. I was thinking maybe you'd be interested in sharecropping it. We'll split the costs, split the crop, 50-50. You can use my equipment until you get back on your feet. He stared at me, his eyes filling with tears for the first time. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there on the porch of his rented house, a broken man being offered a lifeline from the one person he had treated with the most scorn. Why? He finally managed to whisper. After everything I said to you. I looked out at the street, at the town that was full of broken farmers. Because this whole thing, it's not about being right, Frank. It's about seeing your neighbor through to the next season. Now, are you going to help me get my planter ready or not? That ground needs to be worked. Frank Blevins never owned his own farm again. But he and I farmed that 160 acres together for the next 15 years. He was a good farmer, a hard worker, once the pressure of the debt was gone. We became friends in a quiet, unspoken way. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hard-won humility. Sometimes he'd come over and help me work on the 806. He learned how to split the tractor himself, how to rebuild a hydraulic pump, how to set the timing on the diesel engine. He learned the things I had known all along. The farm crisis eventually ended. The prices slowly recovered. The rains returned. The green and white foreclosure signs came down. But the landscape was changed forever. Half the farmers I'd grown up with were gone, their names fading from the mailboxes at the end of long lanes. The ones who survived were leaner, tougher, and a hell of a lot more cautious. I never got any bigger. The 240 acres my father left me, plus the 160 I bought from the bank, was all I ever farmed. It was enough. The Farmall 806 was my main tractor, right up until I retired. I kept it in perfect running order, a testament to good iron and careful maintenance. My son, David, came back to the farm after college. He had new ideas about computers and soil mapping and genetically modified seeds. I listened to him, and we adopted some of them. But the first thing I taught him wasn't how to use a computer. It was how to use a wrench. One of his first big jobs was helping me do another in-frame overhaul on the 806. He was in his 20s then, strong and eager. I watched him torque the head bolts down, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands already stained with the same grease that had stained mine and my father's before me. When we were done, we stood back and looked at the old tractor. Its red paint was faded and chipped, the decals were peeling, and the fenders were dented. It looked every one of its 30-plus years. "Dad," David said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You know, for what we just spent on parts for this thing, we could have made a down payment on a much newer tractor. One with a cab and air conditioning." I smiled and put my hand on the tractor's warm hood. I looked at my son, and I saw the same ambition, the same desire for progress that I had once seen in a young Frank Blevins. And I knew it was my job to pass on the one lesson that mattered more than any other. "David," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "this tractor represents freedom. It's not about the horsepower. It's about the fact that when you turn the key, you don't owe a single soul a single dime. This farm, this land, this life, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You don't win by being the fastest. You win by being the one who's still standing when the race is over." I climbed up into the old worn seat, the metal familiar beneath me. I turned the key, the starter spun, and the big D361 diesel engine barked to life. settling into the same steady, powerful rhythm I had known for a lifetime. It was the sound of survival, the sound of home. And as I throttled it up, the echo of that sound rolled out across the fields, a promise to the land and to the future that we were still here.